little bit of animation that I've got to do in both of these scenes, and then we'll learn how to render this out with an alpha channel. Because if you guys are familiar with Photoshop, in order to put an object in the background of something, you need an alpha channel. So that's something that we haven't gone over yet. And then once we render it out with our alpha channel, we'll be able to put in our background inside of After Effects. And then we'll just touch on just some real basics in After Effects. I know it's not a requirement for this course, so I don't want to get too deep into it. Just enough so that you guys can bring in the background for your scene, and then we'll wrap up. We'll wrap that up and then export it. All right. So if I check my reference. So in my scene, my text is doing a very small scale downwards, and then it's turning to white. So it's starting, of course, so it's starting as this metallic texture, and it's, a starting size, and then by the end of it, it's maybe 10 or 20% smaller, like it's zooming back, and then it transitions to white. So again, just kind of following my reference, and hopefully you guys are following some sort of reference, or you've got something similar that you're trying to follow along with. You'll know you'll know what steps to go in and what steps to take to recreate what you're working on. So with that being said, I'm gonna watch my reference again one last time and just kind of get a rough idea for how long this wants to be. So I'm going to start at roughly 19 seconds and just watch this. Alright, so it turned again right at 27 seconds. So that's 8 seconds long in my case. So to give myself enough frames, I'm going to do 8 times 30. Which is 240, and you can do math calculations like that right inside most of the attribute boxes in Cinema 4D, which is pretty cool. So starting at frame 0, I'm going to take my text, and I'm going to keyframe the scale. So I'm just clicking the keyframe dots. So at frame 0, it's going to be a size or a scale of 1, and then at frame 240, or did I animate the camera? Oh, I animated the camera. So it looks like we already animated the camera. I forgot about that. So that's a good point, actually. I should kind of mention this. A movement like this could be achieved one of two ways. You could either scale the text down, or you can zoom backwards from it, or kind of make it move away. If you hold your phone or like a notebook or whatever kind of roughly in front of you, you can obviously make it smaller visually by just pushing it further away from you. Or if you imagined it shrinking down, it's kind of the same overall movement. So like with almost anything creatively in a digital sense, there's multiple ways to kind of do the same thing. You can either scale something down, or you can make it move away if you want to make it smaller. So in this case, I'm just going to delete my scale keyframes because I don't need those if I've already done this with a camera. So to delete these keyframes again, I'm just going to hold Control and Shift when I click these dots. Normally you can set keys by either clicking the dot or Control clicking the dot. But if you hold Control and Shift, you can delete the keyframes. So in that case, I've got my animation as kind of basic as it is. It's ready to render. So to render with an alpha channel, which is going to be very important in this case, we need to go to our render settings, and obviously in our output we want to, while we're here, change our width and height to the appropriate size. And then while I'm in here, I'm going to select my frame range and do all frames, because I want to make sure I get all my frames. And then down in the Save menu, which we've been here before, so I'm in my Assignment 2 folder. I'm going to make a new folder for render 1. I'm going to name this Chicken Assignment 2 title. Alright, so I've got my file sequence named. I'm going to check name.number.tiff, which is the bottom option. Again, we did that last time around, and that's an important thing. That's an important setting to change, so that way the order of your files comes out in the right order, because you don't want the computer to read your sequence like kind of jumbled back and forth. So there is conveniently a checkbox called alpha channel, which in this case we want to check because we want an alpha channel, and so that's good. And that should be really all we need to do as far as the alpha channel. That's a pretty simple setting to enable. And then last but not least, I'm going to set my anti-aliasing to best, just because we want to make sure that this renders as cleanly as possible. And again, I'm just going to render one of my frames to make sure that I'm happy with this. Alright, so if I compare that to my reference, now it's not going to be, you know, the closest match ever, but it'll be most of the way there. We can always make more adjustments in After Effects, because it works a lot like Photoshop, where you can make areas brighter or darker by using adjustment layers and such. So in general, I've got some sort of brighter spots and some darker spots. I've got these highlights along my bevels, which are all good details that I'm trying to recreate. You know, some of these highlights along the sides of my letters. And if I really wanted to be super proactive, I would make this border and then the studios at the bottom. So with that all set up, I'm gonna render to the picture viewer, and then I'm just gonna let this render, and you can see that your alpha channel is working properly by going to the Layers tab. So this is none of these tabs we've really clicked before up to this point, because we weren't rendering with an alpha channel for the desk scene, so we never needed to look at any of this. But I can check single pass, and then I can click my alpha channel, and just like you would expect to see like in Photoshop, and when you go to the Channels tab instead of the Layers tab, in your RGBA channel, you would have a white and black image just like this, where white is going to show up in After Effects and then black isn't going to show up. So now I can take my metallic texture or my metallic letters, and I can put this red background behind it, and then I can always change that red. You know, if I was doing a broadcast spot at work or whatever, if the client said, oh, we want a blue background, and then you do the blue background and they're like, wait, no, let's do dark blue, and well, then you just change one layer in After Effects. You don't have to re-render, you don't have to re-render this whole sequence, because this might take a while to render. It might take a while to render my animation. In some cases it could take hours or days at work, for a big job. So that would, that always sucks when you've got to re-render something. So that's why we try to break up as much as we can. Like I said, Cinema 4D is only one tool in your toolbox. You've got the whole Adobe suite and dozens of other programs at your disposal to work with. So I am gonna, while we're waiting for this to render, which might take a while by the looks of it, we're gonna jump over to, just gonna save, and I'm gonna jump over to the Gotham scene for you guys, because I know that some of you is not too happy. Alright, so some of you guys, instead of animating, instead of having a simple animation like my Marvel example where the text is kind of always on screen, my real animation is going to come in After Effects where I make this turn white. But if you guys are doing the Gotham example, I don't think I have the video reference of that, but in the Gotham intro, the text comes kind of from off screen and it zooms past, the letters zoom past the camera. So I'm just gonna turn off that blue layer that we went over the layer shader with, just to get this back to normal concrete looking text. So if we jump out of our camera and just by unselecting the white check mark on our camera, we can see where our camera is placed right here, and we can see our text. So if you are doing one of the examples that animate like Gotham, in this case what you want the text to do is you want it to come kind of from out of view of the camera. So see, I moved it away, so now the camera can't see the text because the text is behind the camera. You want to animate the text coming in kind of like this, and we'll do that just by setting some keys. So I'm going to select my MoText, and I know that I want to move it, in this case, on the blue axis, which is the Z axis. So I'm going to kind of position this. So I'm going to select my first keyframe at frame 0 just by keyframing the Z position. Then I'm going to come forward a while, a couple seconds or whatever. Then I'm going to drag this back into place. Just kind of see the way that it looks. And it's important to set up your render output region because, actually let me undo that. It'll be a little tough if you're towards the back, but in the viewport you've got this kind of grayed out region on the sides, and I can make this more apparent. If we animate our text, for example, we can see that the G and the M are going to be cut off with the current render resolution. So it's important to set your render resolution, because now you're going to see that a slightly different amount of the G and the M are cut off now because the aspect ratio changed. So I know in this case I actually have to move my text further back so that it's going to be fully visible. So now if I play through my animation, I can see that the text comes in and its final landing point is fully visible. So I'm actually going to make that happen a little bit faster, I think. So I'm going to select my second key and just kind of move it over, kind of just using instinct to figure out where it should be positioned. But this is a pretty good amount, I would say, because this will give me some time now in After Effects. If I have the whole second half of my animation, I can do, I can maybe animate the clouds or something in the background, because in our, of course, every time. Oh man, I don't have reference of the whole frame, but some of you might remember there's like a city with a night sky, and then there's a reflection, kind of like a lake. It's almost like there would be a whole like cool Photoshop file that you could make up. You know, if you are proficient in Photoshop, you could, you know, use the skills at your disposal to take images of like a night skyline and you know, drop a sky behind that, and maybe a reflection of the water or whatever. You guys would be able to put together that Photoshop file, and you can import that PSD into After Effects, and then we can layer this animated text over it. Again, you know, like I keep saying, like a broken record, Cinema 4D is only one tool at your disposal, and if you're really good in Photoshop, you know, if you're good at like matte painting or retouching images and combining images, you know, you can make some really cool looking environments or like scenery that you can put your rendered objects in. So in that case, I know in the reference, the text comes in and then it kind of lands in place, and then for the rest of the animation, there's some other subtle stuff happening. So I'm going to leave my second key kind of halfway through. Again, so I will just set my output, set all frames, select my save point. Again, I want to check my alpha channel, super important, and my name.number.tiff, and then anti-aliasing, select best. And I would be ready to render this scene. So again, not a ton of animation in this example for the Cinema 4D side of things. It's really in After Effects or in Photoshop is where this scene would kind of come together. So if I was in your guys' position, I would click render. I'm already rendering my Marvel text, so can't render two things at once. So my render out of Cinema 4D is finished. My camera animation with my text is not on screen. There we are. So my animation is finished up rendering. I've got my text that kind of scales backwards a little bit. Alright, so I'm going to jump into After Effects. So Again, I can go to File, Import, File, or just double click in the project panel to import my render, and I want to make sure that TIFF sequence is checked, so that way it brings in all my frames. And then you'll get this pop-up, and this pop-up is because it's detecting an alpha channel on our footage, which is good, because that means that our render was set up in Cinema 4D correctly. And alpha channels in terms of like footage and video editing and stuff, it can get a little complicated what all these settings mean. But for the most part, you should be able to just check straight, unmatted, which is this middle, the middle circle, and then make sure the color is black if it's not. Or wait, no, you won't need to. You don't need to change the color if you just click straight. So then you can click OK, and it'll import. Cool. And then we can make a sequence out of our render by dragging it onto the new comp button. Alright, so now in After Effects we've got our animating text where it's kind of shrinking backwards, how we set up. So in my reference I've got a black background, or I mean a red background, sorry. And actually I'm going to import my footage. I'm actually going to import my reference video into After Effects because I want to know what color red to make that. Because if this was a real job, I would need to know exactly what my color value would be. So I can scroll through here. Cool. Alright, so this red, up in the upper right hand corner, up here in the infos panel, we've got our RG and B values, and I can see that I've got a 0 in both blue and green and 159 in red. So I can make a layer. I can make a layer with that exact color red, just very similarly to how you would in Photoshop. Kind of I can now in my composition that has my Marvel, my render, I can go up to Layer, New, Solid, and a layer solid is what After Effects calls just a blank color layer. So I'm gonna make a solid, and I can name this background. And you want to make sure that it's the same size as your render. And in here I can click the color and I can punch in 159, 0, and 0. And then I can hit OK, and it made a red layer. But just like in Photoshop, in my layers down here, I want to make sure my background is below my render, because After Effects works from bottom to top, just like Photoshop does. And so now I've got my Cinema 4D, my Marvel text logo, and it's on top of a red background. And if I check my reference, you can see that there's a little bit of vignetting. So there's a little bit of like kind of a shadow. It's hard to point out. I use the pointy stick. I've got a little bit of shadowing kind of down here, and over here, and up in that corner as well. And again, these sorts of details are what's important to recreate. And it's a little bit trickier to do something like that in After Effects. Whereas in Photoshop, you could just make a new layer and use the brush and just kind of paint, with like a really feathered brush, for example. That would be a pretty easy way to replicate that. But what I can do in After Effects is I can make another solid, just up in Layer, New Solid, and I can just make this kind of like a dark black. And on this, what I can do is I can use the pen tool, and I can kind of trace that shape. So I know I want to use this corner a little bit in this corner, a little bit in this corner, and then I want to skip that corner up there. So this mask is actually backwards. What I can do is I can hit M for mask, and I can go from an add mask to a subtract mask. And so now I've got a kind of a shadow in the three corners, but this mask would be feathered quite a lot more than 0. So I can hit F for feather actually, and I can raise this feather value up a bit. And if I play with this enough and move these mask points, kind of move them around, I can get something that'll a little bit more closely resemble the reference. I can probably in this case lower the opacity of this layer, and the opacity button is T for whatever reason in After Effects. So I'll hit T, and I'll just kind of pull this down from 100% down just a little bit. It's just a little bit too dark to match the reference. So I'll name this vignette. And one thing I do recognize is that if I go back to this metal, mine looks a little bit too dark, kind of. This is a good bit brighter, kind of like it's just a little bit more shinier than mine was, which is no big deal. We can always fix it in post, as they say. So over here on the right, I've got my effects and presets, and this is where you can find stuff like adjustment layers and all that fun stuff, similar to Photoshop. So one of the tools you guys might know in Photoshop is like levels or curves. Hopefully you guys are familiar with those sorts of adjustment layers. So I'm going to try levels. So I can just type in levels, and then I can just double click it, and if I've got my render selected, when I double click the levels button, it'll apply the levels effect to just this layer. Like in Photoshop, there would be another layer kind of above this called levels, and then you'd have to hold down Alt to make a clipping mask or whatever to it. You don't have to do that in After Effects, and I can just kind of adjust this levels effect, and it'll operate the same way that it does in Photoshop. I can kind of pull in the right side and pull in the middle a little bit, and I'm just trying to brighten this up a bit because I know that mine's a little bit too dark compared to the reference. So that's maybe a little bit too bright. I just pull that back down. Alright, so that looks a little bit closer now. And again, I can scrub through the timeline. So this little blue kind of time indicator, this shows you what frame you're at, and you can click and drag this to move around. So I can see towards the end of my animation is where I want to start to turn it white, at least in my case, because my Marvel logo is turning into just this flat white, it almost looks like it could just be drawn in Illustrator. This is real fun. There we go. So I want to turn it this kind of off-white color, and we can do that with an effect that's not too tricky to use. It's called Fill, and that just made my text red, super 255, bleeding my eyes red. And if I jump back over, if I figure out what color value I want this white to be, because it's not exactly a white, it's kind of like a cream almost. So again, I see up in my info palette, I see 202, 204, 178. So I'm going to punch in my color 202, 204, 178. And so now this is kind of like that off-white cream color. And what I can do is, so I can keyframe the opacity of this effect, actually. And in After Effects, setting keyframes works pretty similarly to Cinema 4D. There's this like kind of stopwatch button, which is pretty similar to the dot that we're used to in Cinema 4D. So if I click the opacity, now what I can do is, since I have a keyframe on this layer, I can hit U and open that up. And I know this is going to seem pretty complicated if you haven't used After Effects before, but it works very similarly to Cinema 4D. I've got a keyframe over here, and if I want to set another keyframe, I just move my time indicator either backwards or forwards, and then I can just lower this down to 0, and we'll see that that actually made my text invisible, which I don't really want. But again, we can use lots of different pieces together. So actually, if I just duplicate my render and I delete the fill off of the bottom layer, so this is the C4D render metal, and it's helpful to layer or to name your layers. So then this will be C4D render white. So now this should work, where because I've got one layer kind of underneath that is just the metal effect, kind of down at the bottom, and then in front of it is an exact duplicate that has that white color effect. It's almost like I'm making that white color effect appear out of nothing. I'm just taking it down from 0 opacity up to 100% opacity, and all I'm doing is animating the opacity value, and I'm kind of just blending between these two. So I start with a metal, and I blend up to this off-white color. And that's pretty much all there is to my Marvel sequence. Again, I can hit U, and if I wanted to kind of adjust where these keyframes are, if I rewatch my reference, obviously there's this cool lens flare and all that fun stuff. But it actually looks like the color change happens while the text is still moving. So actually I might want to move my keyframes, just kind of reposition my keyframes so that it's still scaling, or it's still moving backwards while it changes to the white color. And then it kind of just rests in place, and then it cuts to black. And that's pretty much it. So now I should actually probably save. Oops. Okay. Just go to File, Save, and I'll want to put this in my folder, assignment 2. So this will be Marvel title. And then again, all I have to do to save it out is go up to Composition, Add to Render Queue, and now that I'm in my render queue, I can click lossless, and I want to save out QuickTime with H.264 selected. Click OK, and click OK. And then I'll tell it where to save. So good, that's already going into my folder. Assignment 2 title. And then I just click render. All I've got to do is click the render button over here, and it'll save out my file. And that's all there is for my Marvel sequence. But if you guys were doing something like the Gotham scene, where you've got a different kind of colored background, if I Google so if I look at this Gotham title reference, if I was trying to recreate this, I would probably want to jump into Photoshop and put together this kind of background and using like a city's skyline image and then a sky and this image of this lake kind of reflected, and I'd want to reflect the buildings and the water and all that, and I could make this cool background. And to bring that into After Effects, I'm actually just gonna save this. Sure. So to import a background, like in the Gotham scene, what you would want to do is delete some of this junk. You can just go to File, Import, just like you're importing the other stuff, and you wouldn't want to bring it in from your Downloads folder, but I'm just trying to do this real quick. So if I wanted to bring this background into After Effects, and let's just say I did a really good job. Open, please. Let's just say I did a really good job in Photoshop and I recreated this background. Just for the sake of this, pretend that the text that says Gotham isn't here. Just pretend that it's just the city and the night sky and all that. Yeah, actually I can do that. All right, so there's no more text. I hid the text. Let's just pretend that this is our super awesome backdrop in Photoshop. Oops. Nope, it should come in. So hopefully this goes pretty quick. Looks like it's going pretty fast. It works very similarly. You would just want the Gotham render layer above. Very similarly to how my Marvel scene is set up, you would have a background layer, which would be your Photoshop file, and then you would have your render kind of above it in the layer. And we'll recreate this real quick as soon as this finishes.